This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Who could have imagined, between the events in Poland and Qatar, a more shocking and disturbing backdrop to this morning's speech? Our hearts go out to our Polish and Qatari friends. The speech is a speech which has grown in importance over the years, and I think the fact that so many of you have turned out this morning is testimony to that. I'd like to welcome the ambassadors present here on our board. Thank you all for coming. We're delighted to have such a distinguished panel to take us through their expectations for the speech and their reactions to it. Paddy Smyth will conduct the proceedings. Paddy is one of Ireland's most distinguished journalists, having twice served at the Irish Times in Brussels, served in Washington and been foreign editor of the Irish Times. Francis Fitzgerald is former Taoiseach, member of the Dáil, and recently a member of the European Parliament. Francis is one of our foremost politicians and brings a wealth of experience to the debate. Ambassador Haney is unrivaled when it comes to all things European. He was Ireland's permanent representative to the European Union. Bridget Laffan is a legend in these circles. She is a super respected commentator and academic, Chancellor of Limerick University, and taught me as a student. Cian Walsh is what's known as a young person, and we're delighted to have discovered him in Cork, and his insights will be particularly interesting coming from his own perspective. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
State of the Union address by Ursula von der Leyen. We have to say initially that the meeting has been organised by the European Commission, the European Parliament Liaison Office and the Institute of International and European Affairs. Please note that the panel discussion and the Q&A session are on the record. Please invite the please invite the guests to submit their questions via the Q&A. So I'm doing that via the Q&A function on Zoom if they are if you're watching online. And I would ask speakers who contribute from the floor or online to identify themselves and their affiliation before asking a question of the speaker. You've had the speakers introduced to you. I want to just set the thing in a to the speech at the beginning of her first term in 2020, and it is quite strikingly different from what we are going to hear today. We were in the middle of COVID. We were talking about a thing called Next Generation EU, which was funding for the response to COVID. A period she described as one of profound anxiety. But thanks to our unique social market economy, Europe, she said, could face up to that, and to a great extent has done that. She spoke about the need to reform and revitalise the multilateral system, which had never been so urgent, and that the EU would lead reforms of the WTO and WHO, which had largely been destroyed by Trump. Whose return sets a context for this speech, and a line that I remember particularly is that the European Union is on the side of the people of Belarus, which perhaps shows how times have changed. She talked about rebuilding a transatlantic agenda, and I suspect we will hear more about that today. Now we have a return of Trump. We have a transformed strategic situation. Peter mentioned the shooting down last night of Russian drones by Polish Air Force and NATO planes. We have a situation in which Ukraine is center stage, and transforming the strategic balance in Europe, and I think it's clear to see that this will be the major preoccupation of Ursula von der Leyen's speech. And then we have challenges like almost never before on trade, on immigration, on China. And context is also one which is quite different. 2 years ago, Mario Draghi produced an incredibly important report on competitiveness, and one of the real tests of the speech today is going to be to the extent to which the President of the Commission lives up to the level of ambition set by the Draghi report. The Bruegel Institute in Brussels talks about the need for doubling the annual financial framework, which is also going to be a key part of this address. The big challenge internally for the European Union in the course of the next year and during the Irish presidency, of course, will be negotiating the next MFF. And Draghi had spoken at the time of the slow agony of decline that the European economy was facing. Will the address today live up to the demands placed on it by the report, which got support throughout the Union, but whether or not there's the political will really to implement the sort of qualitative changes is not clear. So a new geopolitical reality of great power competition, and what I want to do before she speaks, and I gather we will see when she stands up to speak, and we will cut to that. But before that, I just want to maybe run through our panel and ask them what they're expecting or hoping from this address. So, Bridget, perhaps you would like to answer that.
Well, I think that it's important to think of the context, not just for Europe, which you've outlined in great detail, but for von der Leyen herself. She's had a very tough start to her second mandate, much more difficult than now. Putting her feet under the desk in 2020 and suddenly with COVID was also very challenging. But the challenges, as you described, are much more serious for Europe now. And it's important to remember she's already had one vote of no confidence, which she survived pretty comfortably. But she's dealing with a European Parliament that's more fragmented with less stable majorities than ever before. And so it's a very challenging environment. And this week there was what was called the Eurobazooka poll, not in every member state, but in about 6. And it showed 60% were either favourable or very favourable towards her resignation. So that again means the sentiment, and it was all around what was described by the respondents as the humiliation of the trade deal. And that just tells me that the European publics and electorates really aren't as cognizant as one would have expected them to be of just how transformative a period we are in terms of geopolitics. In terms of the speech, I think we know the areas she's going to touch on, but I think we should watch what does she start with. What for her, for those who constructed the speech with her, what do they consider they have to open with and close with? That's what I would, because I think we know the themes, but it's what she focuses on.
Francis.
Yeah, well, it's one of the big set pieces of her time of the year in the Parliament. It's as a parliamentarian, you're always hoping that your areas of concern that you brought to her attention and the Commission's attention will be in this speech. I mean, I think the overnight events are the totally transformed geopolitical situation that we're in, as you said, compared to 2019. It's all has changed geopolitically since 2019. We thought Brexit was the big thing then. It was. Digital, the Green Deal, all of which she negotiated fairly successfully. But now suddenly she's in this very tricky position in a weakened Europe, really, from a competitive and innovation point of view. And that's one of the big areas as well that she's going to have to address. You know, how does European business generate more competitiveness, keep jobs in Europe in the face of the tariff situation, where I felt the media reporting of her and the general reporting was a little unfair to her, actually. You know, it was kind of presented as a humiliation for Europe. In fact, it was the result of absolutely intense negotiations, you know, with America, and probably as good as could be got at the time. So that'll, you know, it'll be interesting to see what she has to say on competitiveness and supporting business. The geopolitics, obviously, defence. More spending on defence, you know, what's she going to say about that? More support, moving Europe closer from a defence point of view, which raises, you know, very interesting questions for Ireland and some other countries in particular. And I think they'll definitely be some of the main themes. Whether there's anything on the social side or not will be interesting. It hasn't featured that much in recent times at all, whether she'll go after any particular area. And of course, defending democracy, misinformation, disinformation, where is that at the moment? Will she have something to say on that? So I'm sure there was some hasty rewriting this morning or last night, given the events.
Tom, can I ask you what Ireland may be particularly interested in and preoccupied by in the speech?
Thank you, Paddy. Just a brief remark on context has been mentioned. I mean, this speech is important. It's a sort of a temperature shot. It's a snapshot of where we are at the moment. But we have to remember it's a speech by the President of the Commission to the Parliament. The Council isn't there. And while the Commission can propose, the Council disposes. So Ursula von der Leyen can say what she wants and propose all sorts of things, but at the end of the day, it will be the Council who decides. So we have to remember that they're not in the room at the moment. In terms of Irish interests, it will be of interest to see what plans she's setting out for the next year or so. We have the presidency in the second half of next year. So certainly in foreign affairs, there will be a lot of interest to see what legislation might be on the table when we come into the presidency. We will also, I think, be interested, and as Frances has said, on what she says about competitiveness. I think there's been some disappointment at the Draghi report. I think the Commission has shown in its reaction to Brexit, COVID, Ukraine, that it can take action fast with a very determined approach if it wants to. And I think there is a feeling that the Draghi report deserves that sort of strong, determined action from the centre, and we haven't really seen it yet. I mean, other issues I think would be of interest, such as enlargement. What will she say about Ukraine and the whole enlargement process? We would be interested to see what she says about Gaza, where we know here in Ireland there's been quite a lot of critical comments about the approach of the Commission to Gaza, so it would be interesting to see what she says. And finally, on defence and security, certainly Ireland has moved quite considerably on that agenda. We might be concerned about the amount of money being mobilised in support of the European rearmament agenda and who's going to pay for what and how much money this might cost Ireland at the end of the day.
Thanks. Ken, you're particularly concerned about the green agenda.
Yeah, thank you, Paddy. I guess in terms of asking the question earlier of what we're expecting, what we're hoping for, and the two things aren't necessarily linked, of course. So the European Green Deal, I guess, as a young person and as a spokesperson, not necessarily representative of all youth, but a considerable proportion. I'll be very interested to see today if the Green Deal is mentioned at all, and if it is, in what context are And you mentioned earlier about looking back at the 2020 address. And I was doing that myself and seeing that the European Green Deal was what Ursula von der Leyen once described as Europe's kind of man on the moon moment. And now it kind of seems like maybe we're aborting our space mission kind of halfway through liftoff. And it'll be just interesting to see where the Commission is going to land on a green agenda today, to what extent or if it is brought up at all.
I'm now going to ask our panel to comment on what they saw as the important themes and perhaps the omissions in Ursula von der Leyen's speech. And I'm going to then, after a bit of discussion from the platform, going to turn it over to questions from the floor. And I would say to those who are watching this online that please submit any questions that you have via the Zoom Q&A. Donald Trump announcing that he was going to christen the Department of Defense, the Department of War. I'm wondering, is that what Ursula von der Leyen is redefining the peace project that is Europe as? Perhaps, Bridget, you'd like to take up the theme of security and defence.
So firstly, I don't think it's a reframing of the peace project, because unless you have freedom and democracy, you won't have peace. You have a real challenge when it comes to peace. I think if one looks at the speech, a third of the speech was on Ukraine and Gaza. And that's because there is a war on the European continent. The battlefield conditions are very dangerous at the moment, and leaving out all of the territorial issues, then I think the European project itself will be in peril. I think European security will be in peril, and the EU will have failed not at its peace mission. So I was not surprised at the concentration. I thought also on Gaza, this is probably the most attention von der Leyen has ever given publicly to Gaza, and was the strongest. She identified the key problem for Europe is it's not united on the steps forward. But I think we can take it that in this period, in the next 5 years, that defence and security woven into issues of economy, political economy, and the relationship with the United States, it's all interconnected, interacting and intersecting. I also thought, interestingly, that Ursula von der Leyen is a Commission President who happens to be a woman. But this was a speech that was very clearly made by a woman. She kept trying to personalise it. She kept trying to bring it back to children, in other words, to talk not just, as often is the case when it comes to European integration, about systems and governance and structures and laws, but also to actually try to root it in people. That was a theme that went right through the speech. So I think it's inevitable defence and security will be a dominant issue in Europe for the next. Will be number one, and not just defence and security, but also, of course, the link to the transatlantic, although she doesn't really address the fact that Europe can no longer rely for its security on the United States. That is what didn't bark, because she doesn't want to say that.
And Tom, do you think that Ireland will be apprehensive about this emphasis on defence and the coming defence union?
Thank you. I mean, I agree with Bridget that defence and security will be central, and what von der Leyen said will require quite careful analysis. I was struck by the fact she started off by talking about the world now being dominated by power, that the United States, China, the bigger the military you have, the more power you have, and we're moving away from the global situation we have at the moment to one where power dominates. It was a pity in some ways she didn't talk about, I mean, for Ireland, we were always very committed to the multilateral system with the United Nations at its core, and the peaceful settlement of disputes. She said nothing really about multilateral cooperation. It was very much a strong focus on power. And in relation to defence, I was struck by her reference to the possibility of a defence semester. We have a European semester in the economic area, which is quite onerous and complicated for the member states. It was introduced after the financial crisis. The idea of a European defence semester where the Commission would start looking in detail at your defence expenditure, your capacities and so on, I wonder how that's going to play out. I can't really see and the line between where Europe starts and NATO ends on defence is becoming quite blurred. And again, I just wonder about that whole defence element of her speech, what NATO might make of some of it. And that's all going to have to be sorted out. So yes, I think Ireland would be a bit apprehensive, but there's a lot of questions raised by what she said that are going to have to be looked at very carefully.
Francis, how did you react?
Well, I thought it was a very comprehensive speech. I mean, just looking for a second at the dynamics of the way she presented the speech, I've never seen so many slides and visuals and a very sophisticated presentation, actually, as a speech. Leaving that aside, I thought it was very comprehensive. I thought it started off in a very stark way. I mean, we're talking about fighting. She talked about the uncertainty, the ground shifting for European citizens. And I think that she caught the reality of what we all feel. How do you find the language to describe the current situation? And I thought she did that, extremely well, focusing hugely on Ukraine. Quite groundbreaking in terms of what she had to say about Gaza. I mean, this is much more leadership she's suggesting. It'll be very hard to get the majorities in terms of sanctions on the extremist settlers and the trade agreement and so on. I mean, this is totally new for her. She's been heavily criticised in relation to her stance on Gaza, that initial visit to Israel and so on. Again, it'll be hard to get majorities for that, but it's a very clear policy and political statement in relation to Gaza. I think then very much...
Can I just ask you there, I mean, what she did was she talked about famine and the distressed Palestinian community. She didn't actually criticise the Israeli military campaign. That was quite striking.
No, she didn't, but she did announce those initiatives, which are the first time she's been that strong against Israel. So I think before. And then I think there's a contrast with the rest of the speech. In some ways, it's almost like, we have these appalling wars going on. Europe is heavily vested in the outcomes, and it, as Tom said, it will lead to shifting boundaries in relation to defence. But then she goes on to talk about all of those other challenges, ranging from, new European small cars, which we'd all love to see, to housing policy. I don't know how many times I've heard in Europe that housing is a national competence. Health was a national competence as well, of course, and we saw how Europe reacted to COVID. You saw that strong statement about housing and all of those sort of issues, food, supporting innovation in Europe, a new startup. There's a whole range of initiatives. There's a huge work programme in what she's announced there today. She also defended the trade deal strongly, because she has again been very criticised for the trade deal with the USA, and she says, and the market, she said, this is the best we could have got. We weren't going to get into a trade war with the USA. Can you imagine what that would have looked like? She also took on the disinformation and democracy building. So she touched an awful lot of boxes. The forest fires, I think, was about, she didn't say much else on climate. I know you're particularly interested in that, but, you know, she focused on that. And it's interesting, that's what the G7 did as well. They focused on that kind of, if you like, micro aspect of climate change.
Yeah, Cian, she was sort of ticking a box on climate change rather than announcing any serious involvement. Green Deal is still there, but
how European industry can benefit from investing in clean technology. So it was way more focused on how corporations, I guess, can actually benefit from taking climate action and reducing emissions. It was very focused, I think. There wasn't actually a mention of the specific 2040 target that was proposed. It was mentioned, but the figure of 90% was kind of omitted, which I thought was quite interesting. I think for an Irish context, it was really interesting to see that the Circular Economy Act was mentioned. So Ireland is ranked second last in the EU, just Romania is below us for the management of circular management of waste, which I think is quite interesting. Now, we did see nature-based solutions got a mention, just transition got a mention, but quite surface level overall. And really just focusing in on how industry and clean tech, the Clean Industrial Deal, seems to be the main focus this time around.
Yeah, I want to come back to the thing. One of the things that Frances mentioned, and that was the emphasis on competitiveness. This is something that was brought to the fore by the major Draghi report a couple of years ago. But there's a lot of people who would be critical of the Commission and the Member States, indeed, for failing to implement the Draghi report. How do you see, Frances, her approach to that?
Well, I mean, she does address competitiveness, obviously. I mean, there's a gap, really, when you think of Europe's dependence on, say, critical minerals. It's all outside Europe. Really, that the dependency is huge. So she's talking about this battery booster package. She's talking about the Industrial Accelerator Act. As I said, she's talking about supporting the innovation hubs, supporting business. I mean, I think to that, she doesn't mention him. I mean, it's mentioned more than read, I think, the Draghi report. But, I mean, there are a lot of recommendations there. She does, I mean, it is fairly central to what she's saying. She's talking much more about these new omnibus bills that packages she's going to bring in. I gather they're bringing in one on tech, so it'll be interesting to see what will be in that in terms of supporting European tech companies. And she's trying to get innovation to stay in Europe. She also made a strong statement about, you know, Europe will do its own regulation. And that's obviously a response to Trump saying, you know, Europe has to loosen regulation. I mean, she made a strong statement, we will decide how we're going to manage. That's going to be hard to put into effect, I think. But certainly she wants to protect jobs. And then the focus on science and AI, all of that will be welcomed. I mean, again, she's talking about things like the AI gigafactories, European AI and tech declarations. These are all very big packages. It's in the implementation that we'll, as it comes down to member states, we'll see the reality of that.
A lot of rather German talk about cars and the future of cars.
Small cars.
which may antagonise some of her supporters in the European Parliament.
They like big cars. She's talking about small cars.
But Bridget, do you think that the level of ambition in terms of competitiveness is well, it's certainly spoken of?
No, as we know, Draghi himself is very disappointed, and he's developed into the, you know, the nudger of the European Council. Get on with it. This is very serious. So the issue, because the competitiveness agenda is not one thing, it's lots of things. And moving across this vast terrain, it's deeply transformative of the political economy of Europe. And That is a very difficult thing to do, and it's a doubly difficult thing to do when you're a laggard. And Europe is a laggard in digital, in tech, highest energy costs, vis-a-vis the comparators. So Europe's challenges in that political economy area are deep. I would also say that on the whole simplification agenda, I mean, Tom participated and knows what it's like to produce European legislation and how difficult an exercise it is, and how often what ends up at the end of the sausage, the kind of sausage you end up with, may not be what you want at the beginning, because the filters that all European legislation goes through. But the whole simplification agenda is really important for the following reason. Large companies can cope with regulation. They just set up dedicated units and say, sort that. But when business face difficulties of diversity across the member states, difficult legislative environments, very difficult funding environments, in terms of Europe has an enormous amount of savings locked up, but they're not being invested in the future of the continent, because Europeans prefer to put money into banks than risk on the stock market. The Americans don't. So again, when you say, is it ambitious enough? I think the diagnosis is understood and the strategy is there, but getting from strategy to implementation, but also to the cultural shifts. But again, I mean, European companies just don't want to die. They don't want to lie down and say to the Chinese or the Americans, just roll over us. So you are getting responses in the real economy as well. But of course, companies are now trying to figure, in a very difficult international trading environment. Can you imagine sitting in a boardroom today thinking, my investment strategy for the next 5 years, where will my markets be? Who are my competitors? I mean, it's a very difficult time because of our disruptor in chief on the other side of the Atlantic. And can I just say on the trade deal, because the public opinion data is very clear, this was seen as humiliation. There's one simple stat everyone should remember. Switzerland has 39% tariffs, and that's what was coming. And so European trade with the US, 15% is not a good deal, but 39% in public at the moment is, so Europe needs to keep Ukraine in the game. It needs to deal with the disruption of the United States, but it also needs to maintain financial stability. And I think that's the unspoken threat. And we've had a Eurozone crisis before. We should worry a little, not a little, I think perhaps a lot, about France at the moment. So again, heads of government and the heads of the institutions are juggling with a pretty impossible set of issues. And the question is, are they doing not badly on the impossible or doing very badly on the possible? And it's the uncertainty and contingency makes this very difficult.
On that, coming back to that question of the level of ambition, one of the things that I found most striking about the speech was the complete absence of any reference to the Commission and the European Union's own internal finances, and particularly to the multi-annual financial framework, which must be negotiated over the next 2 years, and which Tom, do you think this is there are things being left unsaid there that need to be said? And are there particular problems? I mean, Ireland is, for example, a net contributor now after a few years of being a net recipient of EU funds. But we're going to be asked to dig very much deeper into our pockets. And she doesn't really talk about how Europe funds these great projects that she's talking about.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, first of all, on the level of ambition, I think von der Leyen is conscious of the criticism of the slow pace of implementation of the Draghi report. I think there was a report from a think tank in the last day or two that said only 11% of his recommendations have progressed. And in her speech, she tried to address the fact that implementation needs to happen. I mean, it's not entirely up to the Commission. A lot of the failures go back to member states where there's big internal divisions about some of Draghi's proposals. So her focus on competitiveness was very welcome, and it was ambitious. There were one or two things in it that struck me as important. One was she did mention the single market as one of the elements of competitiveness, and she talked about the need for a timeline, which is something I think we in Ireland have been quite keen on, that you set out proposals and things by, which could be very helpful. More broadly, I mean, some of her proposals, we used to be quite allergic to references to European strategic autonomy, European sovereignty. Ireland didn't like those sort of vaguely protectionist references. We've gone way beyond that now. We're talking about European independence. And she was setting out a full-fledged industrial policy with a very heavy role for the Commission. The idea that the Commission would sort of try and select winners is not really comfortable for us. She also mentioned in public procurement the need to adopt a European priority, which is something that's been around for a long time and I think propose problems for us. A European priority in public procurement could mean, for example, if we ever build the Dublin but there's also a bid from Germany and France, much more expensive, would we be obliged to go for the French or German bids because we're giving European priority? So that sort of proposal is uncomfortable. We have to see where it goes. On the multi-annual financial framework, I mean, the proposals...
Sorry, can I just add, there was a couple of references to state subsidies being freed up a bit, certainly for example, in housing. And is that something that we're uncomfortable with?
Yeah, I mean, the housing element, I think Francis mentioned it as well. I mean, housing was a big issue in the European Parliament elections because it's a big issue in nearly every member state. And I think the Commission feels obliged to do something, but the Commission doesn't have competence in housing. So there's very little the Commission can actually do. I mean, maybe if they fiddled around with the legislation on environmental impact assessments and its impact on the planning system, that might help. But you didn't mention that. Instead, you talked about a housing summit, which is talking shop. I mean, maybe the Commission can issue non-binding recommendations. But in general, though, you mentioned freeing up subsidies. Again, Ireland wouldn't be too happy with the idea that member states, particularly big member states, can suddenly ignore state aid rules and fund whatever they want in industry. That puts us at a very considerable competitive disadvantage. Yeah, I mean, we would be quite attached to the state aid rules and look suspiciously on any relaxation of them.
Cian, I come back to you. Are there other aspects of the green agenda that you feel could have?
I think that's a good question. I think that it was, as you mentioned earlier, a slight tick of the box exercise, that it was positive to see mentions of nature-based solutions and just transition, but the greater agenda of the European Green Deal that extends beyond emissions cuts was not something that I think was platformed as greatly as before. And I'd probably say that about other areas as well. I think fundamental rights. So I think that in previous State of the European Union addresses, we would have seen greater solidarity, for example, explicitly mentioning LGBTI+. And I think in the context of what we saw in Hungary earlier this year in June, and attempts to ban pride parades, that the references to fundamental rights were quite surface level. Is a very brief mention towards the end of the speech, which I thought was quite interesting. But I guess, and maybe just to come in briefly on competitiveness, because there was a specific mention of students in that, but again, a matter of competency. There's not that much that can be done, and quite a take-the-box exercise. I think it was quite interesting to hear of a legal initiative on short-term rentals, but outside of that, it wasn't anything mind-blowing. But
John O'Brennan online in Maynooth. How, he says, can the President of the Commission speak about Europe's independence moment when the EU agreed a very injurious trade deal with the US that has effectively turned Europe into a vassal of Washington, D.C., when it is giving in to Trump on tech regulation, when it is completely gutting the European Green Deal, which marked Europe out as very distinct from the US. Does anybody want?
Yeah, I'll take that. I think John is wrong,
yes,
and I mean that in the strongest possible terms. Europe had conceded the 10% anyway, so going from 10 to 15, to have a trade war on 5% is a very risky business, because as he would have retaliated, and at the moment, as the security situation in Europe is very challenging. I think it would have been reckless of the Commission, but also the Commission did not do that on its own. Von der Leyen did not go to Scotland without checking back with the capitals. So the European view was not a trade war now. I think she was very clear in her speech that Europe will make its own regulations. And of course, if Europe wants an all-out to ratchet up the conflict in the relationship with the United States just now, with a very unpredictable American president, then I think it might be emotionally satisfying to take on the bully, because he is a bully. But it would be, in my view, not smart politics and very unwise. Europe has got to keep trying to navigate its way in a world that is not the world it would want. It's not the world that Europe is comfortable with, as Tom talked about. Look last week at what happened in Asia. I mean, let's face it, Europe has a very challenging geopolitical, geostrategic environment in which to try to navigate. And I would like to emotionally take Trump on. But if I were sitting as a Prime Minister or President of a government, then I certainly would not go on an all-out a frontal attack with the United States.
Actually,
just now.
I think the attack on von der Leyen in relation to the agreement was completely misplaced, because Šefčovič, I mean, he did intensive negotiations with the Americans over many, many months. He linked back to the member states again and again and again, including Ireland. And, it was the view, as Bridget has said, of the Europe, of the member states, that we go for this. I mean, nobody wants it. Nobody wants 15%. But if you're dealing with authoritarian leader in the United States, you don't know what he's going to say from day to day, to try and get some stability into the trade situation was absolutely critical.
Are there any questions from the floor here? Yes.
Evelyn Mulroe from Novartis, Ireland.
Yeah. Oh.
Thank you very much for this morning. It was quite a rude awakening to listen to some of the State of the Union speech from Ursula von der Leyen. But I suppose one of the questions I have is in the context of Ireland. We've got the European presidency next year. And from listening to the State of the Union, security obviously is very much on the agenda too. And how will that translate in the work of the government from July to December next year during the presidency? And in terms of a life science strategy, it's really critically important now more than ever that Europe has that. And I know that's been launched, but from an Irish perspective, how do we ensure, because I was really taken by the stat that regulation is equivalent to 49% of a tariff at European level. And while, you know, commercial entities can, you know, I think Bridget, you said, you know, you can kind of resource around that, but there's a point where you just can't.
Sure.
And that's my point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's another question down here. I'll take that before I get Tom maybe to start on responding.
Yeah, I mean, the presidency is being worked on intensively at the moment, and I'm sure the people preparing it will have listened very carefully to the von der Leyen speech. I mean, I don't have inside information, but I suspect that we would want to place a very high emphasis on the competitiveness agenda during the presidency, and in particular on issues such as funding innovation. I mean, I think von der Leyen mentioned the doubling of the Horizon funds. I think we would be very strongly supportive of all the efforts being made to increase European funding of research and innovation. And also, I mean, we have tended to lead a group in the EU devoted to the freeing up the single market or dealing with the remaining obstacles in the single market. So again, I suspect Ireland will want to work with countries like Sweden, like Denmark, Finland, the Netherlands, the Czech Republic, countries that are very strongly committed to the single market. Dealing with the remaining obstacles in the single market.
There's no doubt that Ireland's presidency will focus on competitiveness, and there is an agenda in here that I think the presidency will be following, undoubtedly. It's there. There's a programme of work there. I mean, just to make the point again that what hasn't really been discussed in any detail, you made this point, Paddy, is that, you know, the budgetary implications of the security and defence agenda are enormous in terms of delivering on the social agenda that she has outlined, and even the competitiveness agenda. So that's going to be a very tricky one, negotiating the budgets in Europe over the next period, and Ireland will be very much at the centre of that. And just one other point, it's quite interesting that she has focused on the anti-poverty agenda. She's talked a lot about children. I think she does try, as Bridget said at the very beginning, to resonate critical, and also that support for media is very strong.
Well, of course, we're delighted to hear about the support for media. There's an element there too, and maybe we can come back to it on an attempted rapprochement with MEPs who have been unhappy, and the social agenda is very much directed at the left.
The Parliament.
Yeah, can I?
Good morning. I'm Orla Quinn. I'm a member of the board of the IIEA and former Secretary General of the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. I was very struck in her speech by how many commitments she gave for new initiatives. And I just wonder the capacity of the system to actually deliver. I found it hard to prioritise. She didn't prioritise one over the other. I thought there was a lot of initiatives, and the Commission is always ambitious and extending its remit where perhaps it has no remit. And Tom mentioned that earlier in the area of housing. But no more than a big company taking on a new initiative and putting a team on it. Seriously ambitious in terms of all the initiatives she announced. So I do think it would have an impact on our presidency next year. So in coming to it, I think, and Tom pointed out, very careful consideration of what actually is real in that speech and what will be prioritised as a result. Thank you.
There's another question here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador of the Czech Republic, Pavel Šalík. I have just a question. We shouldn't ignore the fact at the beginning she paid quite a high attention calling for unity of the European Union. And she was mentioning at the end as well the process discussion to replace the consensus by the majority decision making. Yeah. Going back to what Tom mentioned about the question marks, what Ireland could have in many goals, what she described, what would be the position of Ireland to this change in the decision-making in the European Union, particularly vis-à-vis discussions about the defense and security policy of the European Union? Don't you think that leaving the consensus, which is obviously necessary when we see that the consensus is more and more difficult to reach in the European Union, and replace it by the decision by the majority, it sounds a little bit contradictory?
I think that at the heart of her point was that you don't have decision-making if you have consensus. Delay and delay and delay. But Tom, would you like to take that back? I don't want to make you. I don't want to make you the spokesman for the Irish government. But
the suggestion to move away from QMV in foreign policy isn't new. It's been there, and I think during Jean-Claude Juncker's presidency, there was a very strong push to do something, and various ideas were looked at. I think the argument was made, even although foreign policy is by and large unanimity, we have managed to do a lot on foreign policy collectively. Look at all the 19th package of sanctions we're talking about. Even although each package has been a bit of a struggle, we've got 19 packages. So you could argue, well, is QMV really necessary? I mean, for Ireland, we've always partly because of the need for unanimity on defence and security. I think there was also a fear that if you bring it in foreign policy, it could leak into other areas, particularly taxation, where we're very attached to unanimity on taxation issues. It did change a little bit in the last year or two, where we're becoming a little bit more open. At one point, we were open to the idea of trying to have an experiment with QMV on human rights issues, so that you could take the human rights agenda and maybe introduce QMV in certain aspects. But then it became very difficult to decide where does human rights end, and it sort of all petered out. And we're definitely not alone in our reluctance. There are many member states reluctant to move to QMV, and some of them are hiding behind us.
Can I?
Yes,
just very briefly on the lots of new initiatives. I think we should start from the premise that the status quo in Europe is not sustainable. The challenges are of a different order. These are once in every couple of hundred years changes in political economy and technology. Whenever that happens, it's a deep period of disruption, and then added to that and layered on that is a world that is a much more difficult world for the EU than it has experienced. The Cold War was a difficult world, but it was a stable. It was difficult but stable, whereas this world is very on political economy, security, the international order, and all of that. So I think the idea that somehow or other the EU can trundle along, I would worry about. I think she was right about the storm and right about the fact Europe's in a fight. I think that has to be the starting premise. Briefly on Ireland. Ireland has always managed to have a reasonably cohesive policy towards its membership of the EU position and how it positioned itself in the system. And it got the reward for that through the Brexit negotiations, in my view, where there was absolute solidarity with a major existential issue for this country. But since Brexit, I think we are struggling to determine what kind of Europe suits what kind of Ireland. I think it's not clear how Europe navigates the issues of, can it retain the sort of red lines on QMV in security and defence? It cannot do anything that harms a majority of the member states doing what they feel they need to do for their security. So I think that we as a country need to have a debate again, to revisit, not our membership, but to revisit what kind of Ireland in what kind of Europe. And it has to be a pretty open debate.
I think the idea of a qualitative shift in the nature of the European Union is at the core of this speech, and I think that's very interesting. And I think Bridget's right about the need for that debate. Peter, did you want to say something?
Before in Europe, and splitting hairs about competence is slightly irrelevant because people expect Europe to lead on issues that matter to them, like housing. Whether the Commission is competent in it or not, Brussels has for too long been seen as tone deaf to citizens' concerns. She's breaking the mould, and I think she deserves credit for that.
I totally agree, and I think she hasn't got the credit that she deserves in relation to Brexit, for example, in relation to COVID, in relation to Ukraine. And I think it did strike me listening to it. It was a leadership speech, and leadership matters. And she did address, as you say, the competence issue is almost beside the point. That's a heretic thing to say, actually. I don't really mean it, but it's beside the point in terms of, if we want to see leadership from Europe, she gave that leadership about children, about poverty, about, the cost of energy, the bills that are going to be coming in. And it is really important. Europe has always been accused of being too distant from its citizens. Now, how you translate that, of course, down to, what actually is going to happen. She did have ideas in there, obviously, about reducing energy costs. I did note the nuclear base that she mentioned. Again, contentious point here, but the need for more connectors and so on. So I absolutely agree about the leadership.
I wouldn't call competence irrelevant.
No, please. I did say it was heretical to say it. You do understand that, Ambassador.
My fear would be on housing, for example, that if the Commission comes forward with lots of high ideas and no competence, that you're making promises you can't keep, which then creates disillusion among the people you're trying to support.
But Tom, you have to see what happened with COVID, with health. Health wasn't a particular European competence, was it? And look at what the leadership around COVID.
We have another question from the back.
Department of Transport, on the nature of Europe and the overall ambitions of what the Commission and we are trying to achieve. What does the panel think the underlying message or the overarching message is about the direction of travel of Europe as a political economic project in its broadest sense? Looking back from the beginning, it was a lot of multilateral, sectoral, specific agreements that gave rise to the European Union. But what is the vision that's overarching the political project? Is it a United States of Europe? Is it something else? And is the current geopolitical landscape capable of supporting that vision, or are we bound to be in a stalemate and the room for innovation could actually exist at a different level?
Thank you. You've been silent for a while. Would you like to try?
I think it's a very good question because it's at the end of the day, this is the first state of the first address, I guess, of this Commission's term. So it's not just about the next year, it's about the next 5 years and what's the strategic plan for the EU. I think the big takeaway from not even listening to what von der Leyen had to say, but just looking at the Parliament and the reactions, is that Europe is in a very divided place and that trying to move towards greater unity on certain issues is just increasingly difficult. And I know that something like QMV for foreign affairs, I don't see it as something that we're progressing towards unity on these issues. And that polarization is quite prevalent within the EU at the moment. So I know that while 9 out of 10 Europeans may feel that Europe needs to be more united to face global challenges, which absolutely, but that 9 out of 10 people don't have the same position of what that position should be. And I think that has become really apparent on the issue of Gaza. As for what the future of Europe and structural changes is, I actually think also something that's very important to note is that enlargement was not that fleshed out. It was mentioned. Ukraine, Moldova, and the Western Balkans was mentioned. Georgia wasn't mentioned. Certain candidate states, but which was also important to note. I think so. What the future of the EU looks like in that context as well, I think there's a lot of uncertainty there.
I think that's right. One of the things that strikes me about the talk of qualitative change of the Union, it's not just about internal structures, but it's about, perhaps to use the horrible word, competences and the enlarging the. And one of the things that really I was surprised that she didn't really deal with was the idea, for example, of common borrowing. Which I think would change the fundamental character of the European, the fiscal union, and the what Bridget, do you think is where are we going? Is this likely to be just a lot of hot air and go nowhere, or is this actually a point of a turning point?
So on the, are we looking to a United States of Europe? If by that we mean a highly centralized federal system with a government, no, we're not. It's neither feasible nor desirable. But what we are looking at is how much collective power can the EU master in terms of capability? And the pressures on it to have more are extraordinarily strong, because the member states, including the largest, are relatively small given the power structures of the world we live in. And so the question is, so the EU is a political system, it's a polity, sits on top of the domestic political systems. Where will that collective one of the classical instruments the EU has had, lawfare, the EU is very good at it, too good at it probably, and now needs to maybe do less of that. A lot will come down to whether or not the EU can develop a public finance capacity. And the public finance capacity, in my view, will be multi-layered. I think there will be more common borrowing, difficult and all as that will be, it will happen. There will be more leverage of collective power vis-a-vis collective procurement, which is another way of using public finance. And there will be more mini coalitions of the willing doing things together using their domestic budgets. So I think we're looking at an EU of multiple, as the member states search for ways out of the dilemmas that they confront. So the other feature of this polity that we're already seeing is there was a time when a president of the Commission would come and have an entire pro-European floor. I mean, they were all pro-European Democrats sitting in the arena. This morning there was a lot of shouting. That's politics. So this is a much more politicized system, less technocratic, and so it's searching for, and there's an embryonic European political space coming. So we are in a transition moment in all sorts of ways, with a lot of tension between public and private power, between the EU and the national, the EU and the international, and it's how those tensions play out will determine the kind of polity in 10 years' time.
I think that's an extremely good summing up of your position, and I was going to say that perhaps the time has come for a general summing up. If there's a pressing question from the floor, I will take that, but otherwise I will ask each of the panellists to briefly summarise their view of today. Cian.
No pressure to go first. So I think that there's a lot to take in. I think that in particular the mention of a lot of initiatives for an Ireland's perspective, I think we tend to go deep and narrow on the things that matter most to us. So there'll be a moment to take in what from this is likely to move forward. I think just maybe one particular area that I haven't mentioned myself yet that I might say as a sum up was in the area of food and CAP and farmers, which was mentioned and also mentioned in the context of the MFF. The level of detail on that was very limited and kind of reduced to a Buy European Food campaign, which I think will kind of leave some listeners maybe in an agricultural field slightly disillusioned with what exactly is coming in that area. But overall, it'll be very interesting to see what comes to fruition from this. And I guess on a personal level, particularly the proposal of a partial suspension of the association agreement with Israel, I think is one of the big ones to watch from a youth perspective.
Okay, Tom?
Thank you. I mean, I think this was a very substantial speech with a lot in it that's pressure about her leadership capacity in recent months. And I think she probably did a lot to address that today. It was a very strong speech. I think she delivered it very well. It was very well written. It does contain a number of very significant proposals. So from the Commission's perspective, I think this was quite a success.
Francis?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a very stark speech, quite upsetting actually in terms of the reality of the world that we're living in at the moment. And she didn't shy away from that at all in terms of the challenge for Europe and the world indeed. And it was comprehensive. I thought it was very well presented. I mean, extraordinary preparation that you could see in it and comprehensiveness. And I think there was, most of the boxes were ticked actually. And there were a lot of new initiatives. And the State of the Union is a very important speech. It does, it does define direction, and it will define the work programme for the Commission. Orla made a good point, the capacity to deliver on all of these new initiatives. But I know from personal experience, when you get something into that State of the Union address, it does make a difference. So it's very important that it was as comprehensive in relation to competitiveness, in relation to the social issues as well. Just important statement of where we're at in relation to all of those social issues as well.
Bridget, to you.
So I thought the language was very interesting because independence moment, I mean, independence is a concept and a word we associate with nationalism. But I think what she's talking about here is not the traditional nation state, but rather Europe's collective capacity. Again, storm, fight, imperialism, war. I mean, these were all late 19th, early 20th century concepts and words. And we're back in such a highly unpredictable and uncertain and contingent world. And a world, as I've said several times this morning, that Europe doesn't suit the European way of doing business. But Europe has got to become fit for this fight, because the alternative is it loses relevance in the world. Economically, it will have less growth, which will impact directly on the social model and the social contract, and make politics in Europe even more difficult than they already are.
Well, I'm just left to thank our panellists and the Commission, Parliament and IIEA for hosting this meeting, and wish you all well.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.